In the early 1700s, the Kingdom of Cambodia stood at a dangerous crossroads. Though centuries had passed since the fall of Angkor, the Khmer kingdom still bore the heavy legacy of imperial greatness and the burden of fragile survival. Sandwiched between two ambitious powers, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east, Cambodia had become more than just a kingdom. It had become a target, a battlefield, and ultimately a pawn in a brutal game of power and domination. The Khmer court in Cambodia's new royal capital after Longvek fell to the Siamese in 1594, struggled to maintain its independence, while Cambodia remained sovereign in name. Its internal politics were increasingly dictated by foreign influence. Both Ayutthaya and the Nubian lords of southern Vietnam viewed Cambodia not as an equal neighbor, but as a strategic buffer zone, one that could be controlled, manipulated, and used to assert dominance over each other. The early 18th century saw Cambodia caught in a cycle of royal succession crises. Khmer kings rose and fell, not because of domestic consensus, but because of foreign favor. Each time a king died or was deposed, Siam and Vietnam saw an opportunity. They would each back rival claimants to the throne, offer military assistance, and send emissaries or troops to ensure their preferred puppet gained power. And once that puppet king sat on the throne, he owed allegiance not to the Khmer people but to his foreign sponsor. This was the birth of Cambodia's long entrapment in proxy warfare. In 1700, a powerful Vietnamese general named Nguyen Haiu Sieng marched into the Mekong Delta and began annexing the area into what would eventually become southern Vietnam. This was the first major step in transforming Khmer land into Vietnamese territory. Known to Cambodians as Kampuchea Krom, the region had been Khmer for centuries, but with each passing year, Vietnamese settlers, troops, and officials flooded into the area, building temples, towns, and trade routes under Vietnamese control. Cambodia's kings protested but lacked the military strength to resist. Desperate to avoid full-scale invasion, they turned to Siam for help, but Siam had its own ambitions. The kings of Ayutthaya viewed Cambodia not as a partner to protect, but as a weakened kingdom ripe for control. The Khmer monarchs found themselves in a dangerous position: accept help from Siam and risk becoming a Siamese vassal, accept help from Vietnam and face Vietnamese colonization. No matter which direction they turned, Cambodia found itself under the shadow of foreign power. In 1710, civil war erupted within Cambodia. Rival princes vied for the throne, and each turned to a different foreign sponsor. One prince sought Siamese support, another turned to the Vietnamese Nguyen lords. Armies from both Ayutthaya and Vietnam entered Cambodia not to help, but to secure their own interests. This would become the template for over a century of conflict. A Cambodian king dies or is overthrown. Rival princes appear. Siam and Vietnam back opposing factions, and the kingdom is plunged into chaos. The Khmer people, meanwhile, suffered the worst. As foreign armies clashed on Cambodian soil, villages were burned, temples desecrated, and civilians enslaved or displaced. Khmer soldiers were forced into armies that did not serve their kingdom. Khmer nobles were pressured to swear loyalty not to Cambodia, but to Ayutthaya or Huk. In 1739, another crisis unfolded. A Khmer prince named Ang Thong ascended the throne with Vietnamese support, but his pro-Vietnamese stance triggered outrage from the court and the Buddhist clergy, who feared Vietnamese domination. Siam, seeing an opportunity, backed another claimant and sent troops into Cambodia. Vietnamese forces responded in kind. Once again, Cambodia became a battleground not for its own survival, but for the rivalry between two larger powers. This period of warfare was not just political, it was cultural. Vietnam sought to expand not just territory, but influence. Vietnamese officials encouraged the adoption of Vietnamese customs at the Khmer court. Vietnamese was spoken alongside Khmer. Royal rituals were adapted to suit Vietnamese expectations. Cambodian autonomy, both politically and culturally, was steadily eroded. Siam, too, sought to influence Cambodia's identity. Pro-Siamese kings were expected to pay tribute to Ayutthaya, send Khmer nobles as hostages, and even send troops to fight in Siamese wars. Cambodia's independence was little more than symbolic. By the mid-18th century, Cambodia had become what many historians call a dual vassal state. Both Siam and Vietnam claimed suzerainty over the Khmer kingdom. Each expected tribute, each expected obedience, each maintained diplomatic and military presence in the region, and when their interests clashed, it was the Khmer people who paid the price. One of the clearest examples of Cambodia's fragile sovereignty came in the 1740s. After a succession dispute, Siam installed a puppet king named Che Cheta III. The Vietnamese opposed him and backed a rival prince, Angst. With both claimants receiving troops and weapons from their foreign patrons, a brutal civil war broke out. Cities were burned. Thousands died. Buddhist temples, which had survived centuries of conflict, were looted by both sides. The cultural heart of Cambodia was bleeding. Eventually, a compromise was brokered. Angst Nagwan ascended the throne, but only after agreeing to maintain friendly relations with both Siam and Vietnam. This was not a victory. It was a submission to reality. The Khmer king could not rule without balancing the demands of two rival empires. This political balancing act, what some Khmer historians call walking the blade, defined Cambodia's royal policy for the next 100 years. Each new king had to carefully appease both Siam and Vietnam. A single misstep could trigger invasion. Choosing to side too strongly with one would provoke retaliation from the other. Meanwhile, the Khmer people endured a century of instability. Farmers could not plant in peace. Monks could not meditate without fear. Nobles lived in constant suspicion, not knowing if tomorrow they would be accused of being pro-Siamese or pro-Viet. The Khmer royal court became a battlefield of spies, conspiracies, and assassinations, all fueled by foreign agendas. Yet, even amid this chaos, the Khmer spirit endured. Buddhist temples were rebuilt. Cultural traditions survived. Royal chronicles continued to be written, carefully recording the struggles of the Khmer people during these dark times. Artists and poets still composed verses about the greatness of the pain of Long Vec's fall, and the hope for a sovereign Cambodia. By the late 1700s, the balance of power began to shift again. The Ayutthaya kingdom collapsed in 1767 after the Burmese sacked the city. For a brief moment, Cambodia had a chance to breathe. Without Ayutthaya pressuring the kingdom, there was hope for internal reform. King Eng Nan II sought to centralize royal authority and resist foreign meddling, but the window of peace was short. From the ashes of Ayutthaya, a new Siamese kingdom rose, the Thonburi kingdom, led by the ambitious and ruthless King Toxin. Toxin wasted no time in reasserting Siamese influence. In the 1770s, he invaded Cambodia, claiming that pro-Vietnamese factions at the Khmer court threatened Siam's security. Vietnam, now under the TSN rebellion, could not respond effectively. Cambodia, once again, was left vulnerable. King Toxin deposed the reigning Khmer monarch and installed a new puppet ruler loyal to Siam. Khmer nobles who resisted were executed. Thousands of Khmer families were deported to Siamese territory. It was not merely a military victory, it was a message. Cambodia could not stand alone. This marked the beginning of a new era in Cambodian history, one in which the kingdom's survival depended entirely on the whims of its neighbors. Siam and Vietnam would continue to manipulate the throne, invade when necessary, and shape Cambodia's fate without ever formally colonizing it. This straddled domination without direct rule allowed both powers to keep Cambodia under control without bearing the cost of administration. For the Khmer people, it meant endless instability, humiliation, and the erosion of sovereignty. But it also meant resistance. In every village, every monastery, and every noble house, there were whispers of rebellion, stories of Khmer heroes who defied both Siam and Vietnam, legends of kings who would rise and restore true independence. the struggle for Cambodia's soul was not over. In fact, it was only beginning. As the 19th century began, Cambodia remained trapped in a vice. Siam and Vietnam, each growing more aggressive in their ambitions, continued to treat the Khmer kingdom as a chessboard for their regional rivalry. The Khmer monarchy, exhausted by a century of manipulation and bloodshed, had no choice but to play one empire against the other, hoping to preserve some fragment of independence, but each move only deepened Cambodia's crises. In 1806, King Ang Chan II ascended the Khmer throne. He was a cautious ruler, well aware of the dangers posed by both Siam and Vietnam. His father, Ang Eng, had spent much of his life under Siamese control. During Ang Eng's reign, Khmer princes were often raised in the Siamese court in Bangkok, educated to serve Siam's interests. This practice created a generation of Cambodian royals whose loyalty was divided. Some favored Siam, others Vietnam, and few were able to act independently. Ang Chan, however, leaned toward the Vietnamese. He sought protection from the Nguyen dynasty, which had by then unified Vietnam under Emperor Jai Long. Ang Chan feared Siam's military strength and its tendency to use brute force to install puppet rulers. Hoping to avoid another Siamese invasion, he formally recognized Vietnamese suzerainty and allowed Vietnamese officials to station troops in Phnom Penh. In return, Vietnam granted him continued recognition as king and provided military assistance. But this decision was not without consequences. In 1811, two of Ang Chan's Prasang Snagon and Ang Em staged a rebellion with the full support of Siam. They marched into Cambodia with Siamese troops, ousted Ang Chan from Phnom Penh, and declared themselves rulers under Siamese protection. Cambodia, once again, descended into civil war. Ang Chan fled to Saigon and pleaded for help from Emperor Jai Long. The Vietnamese responded swiftly, launching a major military campaign into Cambodia in 1813. Their troops drove the rebels out of Phnom Penh and restored Ang Chan to the throne, but victory came at a steep price. In exchange for their support, the Vietnamese demanded deeper influence in Cambodia. Forts were built, taxes collected, and Vietnamese customs introduced at court. Khmer nobles were forced to swear allegiance to Vietnamese-style administration was implemented in parts of the kingdom. Cambodia was no longer just a vassalate, was rapidly becoming a Vietnamese protectorate. The Khmer people, especially those in the central provinces, began to resent this intrusion. While some elites benefited from their ties to Vietnam, many saw their culture and autonomy slipping away. Traditional Khmer ceremonies were altered. The Vietnamese language was used in official documents. Cambodian soldiers were drafted into Vietnamese campaigns. Ang Chan, now indebted to Vietnam, was powerless to resist. Meanwhile, Siam had not given up. In 1833, a new conflict erupted across the region. The Siamese-Vietnamese War, also known as the Le Van Qui Rebellion. In southern Vietnam, a powerful revolt challenged the Nguyen dynasty, and Siam took the opportunity to launch a major invasion into Laos and Cambodia. King Rama III of Siam aimed to reassert Siamese influence in the Mekong Basin. Khmer princes who had fled to Bangkok were brought back and promised the throne if they helped Siam defeat Vietnam. In 1834, Siamese armies invaded Cambodia once again, clashing with Vietnamese garrisons. Towns were razed, temples looted, and Khmer villagers caught in the crossfire. The fighting was brutal and widespread. For 3 years, Cambodian soil became a theater of war between two foreign powers. Khmer royal authority meant little. Both sides claimed legitimacy. Both installed their own candidates, and neither cared for the suffering of the Khmer people. In 1835, the Vietnamese finally crushed the rebellion in southern Vietnam. With their hands freed, they turned their full attention to Cambodia. Emperor Minh, Ma, one of the most centralizing rulers in Vietnamese history, decided that indirect control was no longer enough. In 1835, he formally annexed Cambodia into the Vietnamese Empire, renaming it Turnte, or Western. This was a turning point in Cambodian history. For the first time, Cambodia ceased to exist as a nominally independent kingdom. It was now governed as a Vietnamese province. Vietnamese officials replaced Khmer administrators. The Khmer king, Ang Chan's daughter, Queen Ang May, was reduced to a royal regalia was seized. The Khmer language was discouraged in favor of Vietnamese. Buddhism, the heart of Khmer identity, was suppressed in favor of Vietnamese Confucian ideology. Resistance erupted almost immediately. Across the countryside, monks, nobles, and peasants launched revolts against Vietnamese rule. Secret societies formed, pledging to restore Khmer independence. Armed bands attacked Vietnamese officials and garrisons. The Vietnamese response was swift and merciless. Villages were burned, rebels executed, entire communities deported. This period became known among Khmer historians as the Time of Darkness. Queen Ang May, the only female monarch in Cambodian history, was deposed by the Vietnamese in 1840 and deported to Vietnam with her entire court. Her removal symbolized the complete loss of Khmer sovereignty. Vietnam attempted to install direct rule, believing that the Khmer people would eventually accept integration. They were wrong. By 1841, a massive uprising broke out across Cambodia. This time, it was not merely a local revolt, it was a coordinated national resistance. Former Khmer officials, Buddhist leaders, and common villagers united to expel the Vietnamese. Siam, ever opportunistic, seized the moment and invaded from the west, claiming to liberate Cambodia. But their real goal was simple: to reassert dominance and install their own king. The fighting reached a fever pitch. For over a year, Cambodia was a war zone once again. Neither Siam nor Vietnam could fully control the country. Khmer rebels fought both foreign armies, demanding the restoration of their own monarchy. In the chaos, a fragile opportunity appeared: the chance to negotiate a return to nominal independence. By 1845, exhausted from war and unable to suppress the growing unrest, both Siam and Vietnam agreed to a compromise. They restored the Cambodian monarchy, but under tight conditions. A young prince named Ang Duong was selected as king. He was acceptable to both Siam and Vietnam because he had ties to both courts. But more importantly, he had no illusions about Cambodian power. Ang Duong's reign marked a brief moment of fragile peace. He sought to rebuild the shattered kingdom, reformed administration, and restore Khmer cultural traditions. He knew Cambodia could not withstand another century of war. Instead of provoking Siam or Vietnam, he walked a careful path of diplomacy, trying to modernize Cambodia while avoiding foreign interference. Still, Cambodia was not truly free. Siam and Vietnam continued to watch closely. Any sign of rebellion, any foreign alliance, could bring new invasions. Ang Duong's survival depended on neutrality and submission, but he also dreamed of something more. In secret letters to the French and other Western powers, he hinted at his desire for true independence. He believed that only outside intervention could break the cycle of domination. While he never lived to see it, these early diplomatic efforts would eventually lay the foundation for Cambodia's protectorate under France. By the late 1840s, the proxy wars had faded for now. Cambodia had a king again, a capital, and a semblance of peace. But the wounds ran deep. For over 150 years, the Khmer kingdom had been ravaged by wars. It did not start, manipulated by rulers it did not choose, and ruled by empires that claimed to protect, but only exploited. The Siamese-Vietnamese rivalry had left Cambodia shattered. Its royal court was weak. Its provinces were its temples were scarred by fire and bullets. Its people lived with the trauma of constant war. And yet, Cambodia had survived. The Khmer identity rooted in language, religion, and memory remained alive. Though thrones had been overturned and borders redrawn, the spirit of resistance never died. In the darkest of times, Khmer monks still taught the old scriptures. Farmers still sang the old songs. children still heard stories of Angkor's greatness and the hope that one day Cambodia would rise again. The wars of the 19th century were not just conflicts of armies. They were wars of culture, sovereignty, and memory. Cambodia was not merely caught between Siam and Vietnam. It was targeted by both, subjugated, reshaped, and nearly erased. But despite everything, it endured. As Cambodia entered the second half of the 19th century, it stood at a crossroads. After nearly 2 centuries of warfare, foreign interference, and dynastic manipulation, the kingdom was barely holding together. The once mighty Khmer Empire had become a small, vulnerable country caught between 2 powerful neighbors, Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. But a new force was emerging, one that would change the region forever: the colonial powers of Europe. In the aftermath of the devastating Proxy Wars, King Ang Duong ruled a fragile kingdom. His authority was recognized, but only under the watchful eyes of both Siam and Vietnam. He was officially crowned in 1848 with the approval of both Bangkok and Huc. But each empire continued to exert influence. Cambodia had technically regained its monarchy, yet it was still not truly free. Siam continued to collect tribute and station troops in the northwest, while Vietnam maintained influence in the east. Ang Duong was no ordinary king. He had grown up in the Siamese court, educated in Bangkok and deeply familiar with the political games of the region. But he also understood that Cambodia could not survive another century of being a battleground. In his private writings and diplomatic efforts, Ang Duong began to seek a new path for Cambodia, one that might shield it from both Siamese and Vietnamese dominance. In the 1850s, as France expanded its influence in Vietnam, Ang Duong quietly reached out to the French authorities. He hoped that by forming an alliance with a European power, Cambodia might gain the protection it so desperately needed. But he was cautious. Ang Duong did not want to become a colony. He wanted to preserve the Khmer monarchy and culture, but with Western support as a shield against his aggressive neighbors. Unfortunately, King Ang Duong died in 1860 before he could finalize any formal agreement. His death marked another turning point in Cambodia's modern history. His successor, King No, would be the monarch who ultimately signed Cambodia's sovereignty away, though not without reason. The early 1860s were once again marked by internal instability. Several Khmer nobles and princes, including Norodam's half-brother, Prince Sivortha, launched rebellions claiming the throne. Siam supported some of these factions, seeing an opportunity to reassert its dominance. Vietnam, however, was already weakening under the pressure of French conquest. As Vietnam fell to colonial control, Cambodia became more exposed. In 1863, seeing no other way to protect Cambodia from becoming a battlefield again, King Norodom signed a treaty with France. This agreement made Cambodia a French protectorate. Norodom would remain king, and Khmer institutions would officially continue. But France would handle Cambodia's foreign affairs, military defense, and later, much of its internal administration. This moment marked the official end of Cambodia's centuries-long struggle to remain sovereign amid regional powers. The kingdom had passed from the hands of Southeast Asian empires into the grasp of European colonialism. For many Khmer nationalists, this was a betrayal. But for Norodom and his court, it was a desperate act of preservation, a way to keep Cambodia on the map before it was carved up completely. In the years that followed, French control over Cambodia deepened. By the 1880s, Cambodia was fully integrated into French Indochina, ruled alongside Vietnam and Laos. Siamese troops were eventually withdrawn from Cambodian territory. France forced Siam to renounce its remaining claims in 1907, returning the provinces of Battambang, Siem Reap, and Sisaphine to Cambodia. These lands, once annexed by Siam during the wars of the 19th century, were finally restored. Ironically, it was through French colonialism that Cambodia recovered some of its lost territories and borders, but the price was steep. The Khmer monarchy became largely symbolic, and decisions about the country's future were made in Paris, not Phnom Penh. French administrators imposed new systems of governance, taxation, and education. While they preserved many aspects of Khmer culture, they also marginalized traditional institutions and stifled indigenous political development. Yet even under colonial rule, the memory of the wars and the centuries of foreign manipulation remained fresh in Khmer consciousness. Cambodians remembered the invasions, the puppet kings, and the cultural erosion brought by both Siam and Vietnam. The trauma of being forced to adopt Vietnamese customs, of seeing Khmer kings replaced by foreign-backed rulers, and of losing sovereignty again and again, created a deep historical wound. This collective memory would later fuel Cambodian nationalism in the 20th century. The repeated proxy wars had long-term consequences beyond just territorial loss. They reshaped the Khmer identity. For generations, the Cambodian people had been caught between two powers that claimed to protect them, but in reality used their kingdom for strategic advantage. Religion, language, and royal legitimacy were manipulated. Khmer princes were raised abroad and returned home as tools of foreign courts. Temples were turned into military outposts. Cultural pride was crushed by centuries of humiliation. Even the Khmer monarchy itself was transformed. Once a powerful institution that commanded respect across Southeast Asia, the royal family had become dependent, fragmented, and often distrusted. Some kings, like Ang Chan or Ang May, were seen as pawns of the Vietnamese. Others, like Ang Eng or the rebel princes, were viewed as Siamese clients. By the time of Norodom, the crown no longer symbolized national strength, but a painful legacy of foreign control. But history did not erase Khmer resilience. Even in the darkest periods, the people of Cambodia found ways to resist and preserve. Buddhist monks kept alive traditions and language, even when Vietnamese officials tried to suppress them. Villagers rebuilt temples after every war. Farmers continued to cultivate the land, despite constant conflict. Khmer artisans maintained the motifs and symbols of their ancestors, even as their rulers wore foreign robes. By the end of the 19th century, Cambodia had been altered but not broken. It had been divided, exploited, and colonized, but the Khmer spirit endured. In fact, it was this very experience of survival amid centuries of betrayal that strengthened the idea of Cambodia as a distinct, sovereign nation. The pain of the past became the foundation for future aspirations. In the 20th century, Cambodian nationalists would begin to demand independence not just from France, but from the legacy of Siamese and Vietnamese domination. They invoked the memory of Angkor, the dignity of ancient kings, and the suffering of generations. They remembered how foreign armies had marched across their homeland, and how their kings had been crowned not by their people, but by outsiders. The proxy wars of the 18th and 19th centuries were not just battles between Siam and Vietnam, they were wars over Cambodia's soul. And while Cambodia lost its independence in the process, it never lost its identity. That identity would fuel future struggles, including the fight for independence in the mid-20th century and the cultural revival after decades of civil war and genocide. Today, many Cambodians still reflect on this period as a reminder of what it means to be Khmer, not just survivors, but a people who refuse to be erased. In the end, the Siamese-Vietnamese proxy wars left Cambodia weakened, scarred, and divided. But they also revealed the strength of its people. Through centuries of betrayal and invasion, the Khmer nation endured. And that endurance remains one of the most remarkable aspects of Southeast Asian history.